Basil Fawlty is Britain's best-loved comedy character, and John Cleese is most famous for playing him in both series of Fawlty Towers. But Basil wasn't simply a creation born out of thin air. The rude, snobby and arrogant character was influenced on a real hotel manager that John encountered with the Monty Python crew, and whom Cleese once described as the rudest man he'd ever met. This is the origin story of Basil Fawlty. It was July 1970, and Monty Python came to the South Devon seaside towns of Torquay and Paynton to film some scenes for Series 2 of the hit comedy sketch show Monty Python's Flying Circus. They were arranged to stay at Gleneagles Hotel, run by husband and wife Donald and Beatrice Sinclair. Donald was a short man, in height as well as temper, and a retired naval commander who'd been torpedoed 3 times during the war, while his wife Beatrice, known to many as Betty, was glamorous but tough. Mr. Sinclair always resented being in the hotel business, but ran the hotel because of his insistent Scottish wife. One of the first issues that the Python crew experienced with Donald was when Eric Idle's briefcase went missing. Eric had left it by the front door, and when he returned after filming, the briefcase was no longer there. Idle politely asked Sinclair where his briefcase was, to which an impatient Donald, who didn't want to deal with guest questions, eventually revealed it was outside behind the wall by the swimming pool. When a somewhat puzzled Eric inquired on why his briefcase was outside behind the wall, Donald claimed he thought it was a bomb. And even more baffled Eric asked the manager why he thought it was a bomb.
And he said, well, we've had a lot of staff problems recently.
On another occasion, he argued with American Python Terry Gilliam for not using his knife and fork the traditional British way. The endless bizarre behaviour and pitiful customer service was infuriating for the Pythons. So all but John promptly checked out after only 2 days to stay at the nearby 5-star Imperial Hotel instead. A far better establishment, but also more pricey, which is probably why the BBC hadn't booked them there in the first place. John stayed because he had already unpacked, and even invited his wife Connie Booth to stay with him. John recalls Sinclair often at the front desk staring into space until he saw guests approaching, but he then pretended to be busy. If they'd asked for assistance, he was always reluctant to help, such as when John had to repeatedly ask for a taxi to be called. Much like Cleese's Basil, Donald was happiest alone in his small office nearby reception, but would often get interrupted by Betty, who'd order him about. Of course, she knew full well of her husband's issues with guests, sometimes leading her to lock him in the upstairs flat as a last resort so he couldn't upset any more people. Donald would, however, relay to others that it was his wife that drove him to do what he does. A few years later, when John and Connie decided to write a sitcom together, they quickly came up with the idea of a comedy based around a hotel, much like the one they both unfortunately stayed at in 1970, and so Basil Fawlty and Fawlty Towers were born. But Basil and Sybil weren't the only characters inspired from real-life people. Gleneagles Hotel also had a German-Swiss housekeeper called Jetty, inspiration for Polly, and a Spanish waiter named Peep, who in the sitcom transformed into Manuel. Donald and Betty sold the hotel in 1972 to enjoy retirement and take cruises. However, the family were embarrassed and upset with the negative publicity that Fawlty Towers had brought to them, and how in their view they were inaccurately and unfairly portrayed, despite refusing to watch the sitcom in protest. Donald sadly died in 1981 from a heart attack, and Betty died in 2010 aged 95. Years later, however, his daughter did watch a few episodes, and described John Cleese's Basil as a pretty fair representation of her father, despite the obvious difference in stature. In 2015, the Gleneagles Hotel was sadly demolished, and as you can see from this exclusive recent footage, it is now a block of apartments named Sachs Lodge, after the actor who played Manuel, Andrew Sachs. If you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And why not watch our other videos? We have several about John Cleese and Fawlty Towers on the channel. Thanks for watching and cheerio.
You snobs!